In March of 1889, a Norwegian farmer stood on the frozen prairie between his cabin and his barn and made a decision that would take him 6 months to regret and a lifetime to vindicate. His name was Emil Larsen, and he was 41 years old, with the weathered face of a man who had spent 13 years fighting the Dakota Territory and winning through sheer persistence. He had come to the Dakota Territory in August of 1876 with his wife Ingrid, a woman whose determination matched his own, and his oldest son Eric, who was then just 4 years old. Together, they had claimed a homestead under the Homestead Act, 160 acres of prairie that stretched flat and empty in all directions, an ocean of grass that seemed to extend to the edge of the world. He had built his cabin with logs he cut himself from a stand of timber 12 miles away, hauling each log by oxen, shaving it smooth with his own hands, fitting each piece into the next with precision that his great-grandmother had taught him. He had built his barn with the same logs and the same knowledge, and he had built the distance between them into a statement about survival on the northern plains. The distance between the cabin and the barn was exactly 107 yards. He had measured it carefully with a rope and marked it in his memory the way a man marks the measurements of his own body. This distance had seemed reasonable in the summer of 1876 when Emil first measured it, reasonable and appropriate for a farm, when walking between the two structures took less than 2 minutes and the sun was warm on his shoulders. But in the winter, that distance transformed. Winter made it a proposition. Winter made it a test of will and courage and endurance. Winter made that distance a sentence to death. Please subscribe to Arctic Survival. We tell the stories of the people who shouldn't have survived, but did. These are the stories of immigrants who crossed an ocean carrying nothing but knowledge. Knowledge that lived in their bodies. Knowledge that their grandmothers had taught them. Knowledge that had survived wars and famines and the complete upheaval of civilization. These are the stories of people who understood that the old ways were not old because they were useless. The old ways were old because they worked. And when the new world demanded everything of them, when winter tried to kill them, they reached back to what their ancestors had taught them, and they built their way to survival. Emil Larsen was born in 1848 in the Trøndelag region of Norway, a mountainous place in the north where the peaks rose like the bones of a giant. And the winters came early in September and stayed late into May, staying with the kind of patience that wore people down, that broke their spirits, that taught them either to understand cold or to die. His family were farmers and builders. They worked with stone and wood and the specific knowledge, the embodied understanding of how to make a dwelling that would not collapse when the weight of accumulated snow became too great, when the ice pressed down with the weight of a continent. His father was named Halvard, a quiet man with scarred hands. And Halvard understood the properties of materials in the way that some people understand language, the way that poets understand words. He could look at a piece of timber and know what it would do when the temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero, when the moisture in the wood contracted and the cellular structure shifted. He could feel the grain of the wood and predict where it would crack, where the weakness would appear. He could understand stone the way a musician understands an instrument, which stones could withstand freeze-thaw cycles, which would shatter, which would hold heat like a memory. Emil's mother was named Ingrid, the same name Emil would later give to his first wife, and she was the daughter of Elsa Halvardsdatter, a woman who was born in 1798 during the reign of King Frederick VI of Denmark-Norway, and who had lived through 90 winters by the time she was an old woman, 90 winters of learning, observing, building, teaching. Elsa had learned, over those 90 winters, every technique that human beings had discovered to survive the cold. Her knowledge came from generations, from mothers teaching daughters, from fathers teaching sons. from the accumulated understanding of a people who could not afford to forget. In the Trøndelag region, families had been building for centuries, for more than 400 years of documented building. And the knowledge had accumulated the way knowledge accumulates when every mistake is fatal, and every success is remembered and written into the body and the hands and the voice of the next generation. Emil's great-grandmother Elsa had learned from her mother Sigrid, who had learned from her mother Astrid, reaching back through time, reaching back through the generations, reaching back to the ancient days before Christianity came to Scandinavia, reaching back to the days when people had to figure out survival with nothing but the materials that the earth provided and the intelligence that desperation teaches, the ingenuity that comes from standing on the edge of death and choosing to live. When Emil was 12 years old, in the winter of 1860, his great-grandmother Elsa came to live with the family during the winter months. She was old. She was already in her 60s by then, which was ancient by the standards of the time, an age that people did not often reach, a span of years that suggested she had discovered the secret of survival. She had survived more winters than any other person Emil knew, more than 60 of them, winters that had killed people around her, winters that had taken her husbands and children and siblings, winters that had tested her again and again, and she had passed every test. She had the kind of face that showed every year she had lived, every winter she had endured, every loss she had suffered. The skin was weathered like old leather. The eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. Her hands were gnarled and scarred, twisted from work and cold and age, and they moved with a precision that came from decades of work, from a lifetime of shaping materials with intention. She arrived in November each year, before the serious snow came in December, and she would stay until March, when the roads became passable again and travel became possible. During those winter months, 4 months each year for almost a decade, she taught the family. She taught them through demonstration and explanation, through story and through the passing of knowledge that had to be embodied, that could not be fully understood until you had felt it in your hands and seen it with your own eyes and learned it in your body. She showed them how to build certain types of structures, how the angle of a roof determines how snow will slide off it, how to position buildings so that they sheltered each other from the wind, how one structure could be a windbreak for another, how to arrange a homestead so that the collection of buildings became a unified system of protection. She showed them how to use stone and earth to hold heat, how thermal mass was not magic but physics, how materials had properties that could be understood and controlled. She told them stories about the old days, about people in Scandinavia who had learned to live in partnership with the cold rather than in opposition to it, who had stopped fighting the winter and started cooperating with it, who had built their lives around what winter wanted rather than what they wanted winter to be. One afternoon in December of 1861, when Emil was 13 years old, Elsa took him outside into the cold. The afternoon was fading as it did in December, the light disappearing by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the temperature was dropping quickly, would drop to 20 degrees below zero by the time darkness came. Everything had the quality of a warning. The way the wind cut across the snow, the way the sky had turned from pale blue to gray, the way the world seemed to be withdrawing, preparing for the deep cold. Elsa wore her heavy coat, a garment that was decades old, lined with wool, and her wool gloves, and she walked with a stick in her hand to steady herself on the ice. The ice on the ground was slick, and she was old, and one fall could mean broken bones and death. She took Emil to a structure that sat apart from the main house, a small stone building that looked almost like a shed, perhaps 12 feet by 14 feet, with thick walls and a low roof designed to shed snow. "This," she said, and her voice was rough from age and from decades of speaking a language that was not quite the language Emil's generation was learning to speak. She spoke Norwegian as it had been spoken in the 1790s, before language had changed and modernized and moved away from the old ways. Is how you keep alive through the winter. Pay attention. Inside the structure, the walls were thick stone, perhaps 18 inches thick, and there was a small firebox in one corner, a carefully constructed opening, no bigger than Emil could reach around with his arms. The fire that burned there was modest, nothing compared to the roaring fireplace in the main house, nothing like the grand fires that people burned in their main rooms. It was a small, controlled fire, burning slowly, almost like it was meditating, conserving energy, doing only what was necessary. "The fire gives heat," Elsa said, and she gestured toward the small flame, toward the embers glowing red at the base of the fire. But the fire does not stay alive forever. The fire burns the wood runs out, the fire dies. Then what? How do you stay warm when there is no more fire? She did not wait for Emil to answer. She led him to a section of the floor where the stone had been carefully laid in a particular pattern, a pattern that Emil had not noticed at first, a pattern of dark stone and light stone arranged in a way that showed thought and intention. She pressed her hand to it, and Emil could feel the warmth radiating from the stone. The stone was hot, not burning, not painful to touch, but clearly warm, warm enough to transfer heat into her palm, warm enough that the warmth traveled through her hand into Emil's hand where he touched her. The stone was holding heat like a living thing holding memory, like a person holding on to an understanding that mattered. "The stone," Elsa said, her voice taking on the quality of a person delivering teaching that had been delivered before, that would be delivered again, that carried the weight of time, "was built to catch the fire's breath. The fire breathes hot. The fire releases energy. The stone catches it, not in the way that water catches something, but the way that stone catches heat, slowly, into its structure, into the mass of it. The fire dies. The wood is gone, but the stone breathed the heat back out, slowly, slowly, all night, all the next day. This is not magic." She was emphatic about this. "This is not superstition. This is cooperation between fire and stone and the knowledge of how they speak to each other. When you build a structure, you must think like the fire. You must think like the stone. You must understand what they want to do. Fire wants to go up, wants to rise, wants to escape into the air. Stone wants to hold what fire gives to it, wants to capture heat, wants to store it and release it slowly. When you build with this knowledge, when you build understanding these wants, understanding these properties, when you build with respect for what fire and stone are, then the winter cannot kill you. The winter can only test you. And if you have learned what your grandmother learned, if you have learned what I am teaching you, you will pass the test. You will survive." Emil never forgot that afternoon. He never forgot the warmth of the stone beneath his hand. He never forgot the sound of his great-grandmother's voice, the way she spoke with absolute certainty, without doubt, without apology. He never forgot the knowledge that seemed to live in her hands and in the stone itself, knowledge that was older than Christianity, older than kingdoms, as old as people learning to stay alive in the cold. In 1873, at age 25, Emil married Ingrid, a Norwegian woman from a neighboring farm whose family had also brought with them the old knowledge, whose mother and grandmother were builders and understood the same principles that Emil's family understood. They married in the tradition of their people, with a ceremony that lasted 3 days and involved every person in their region, with celebration and feast, and the community witnessing the joining of two families Two bloodlines, two carriers of the old knowledge. 2 years later, in 1875, standing in their kitchen in Norway, they made the decision that would change everything. They decided to leave Norway. The decision came from a conversation about the future. The harvests had been poor that year and the year before. The land was becoming overcrowded, with too many families trying to survive on the same rocky slopes. The future seemed to offer nothing but more of the same grinding poverty that they had always known, more of the struggle that their parents had struggled against, more limitation. But America was offering something new, something that had been impossible in Europe. America was offering land, free land, 160 acres, just for being willing to improve it, just for being willing to stay on it for 5 years and prove that you meant to build something. It was an offer that seemed almost impossible, almost like a dream. The decision was made in an afternoon, but it took 2 years to save enough money to pay for passage. 2 years of extreme frugality, of selling everything unnecessary, of working extra jobs, of scraping together every coin. In 1876, with their son Eric, who was 4 years old, and with hope that seemed almost violent in its intensity, a hope that felt dangerous in its enormity, they boarded a ship in Oslo, a port city filled with thousands of Norwegians who had made the same decision. The ship was crowded and filthy. A ship meant to carry cargo being used to carry human beings, every space filled with people, the air thick with illness and despair. People died on the journey. A child in the 3rd week, an old woman in the 5th, a man who had given up and stopped eating in the 7th. The smell was something that Ingrid would carry in her nostrils for the rest of her life. A smell of bodies and waste and sickness that no amount of time could erase. But they survived. In August of 1876, after 6 weeks at sea, they arrived in Dakota Territory and claimed their homestead, 160 acres of open prairie that belonged to them now, that was theirs to build on, that represented everything they had dreamed of. The first winters were tests. Emil built a cabin quickly, before the snow came, using techniques he had learned from his father and from his great-grandmother's teachings. He understood how to position the cabin so that it would catch the afternoon sun but be sheltered from the wind. He understood how to insulate it. He made sure the walls were thick, the roof was pitched to shed snow, the foundation was solid. He built a hearth not from brick. They did not have brick, but from carefully selected stone gathered from a riverbed miles away. He hauled that stone by oxen, stone by stone, and he built a firebox that was efficient in ways that he could not have explained to someone who had not learned what he had learned. The first winter was hard, but they survived. The second winter was harder, but they survived. 3 children were born in those first years. Knut in 1877, Soren in 1880, and Astrid in 1881. And then, in 1884, Ingrid died. She died from influenza in January. She had been pregnant when the sickness came, and her body could not fight both the illness and the pregnancy. Emil lost her and the child that was never born. He was 36 years old, and he had 5 children to raise and a homestead to maintain. And the weight of that responsibility seemed to have physical dimensions. It pressed down on him like the winter itself pressed down. In 1886, a woman named Liv was born. Emil married her mother, a widow named Clara, for practicality more than love. Clara had her own homestead claim, and together their claims and their resources could support a larger family. But Clara was not strong. She had always been fragile, even before her first husband died. The winters seemed to diminish her. And by 1887, she had contracted consumption. By 1888, she was gone. Emil found himself at age 40 with 5 surviving children. Eric, who was 17, Knut, who was 14, Soren, who was 11, Astrid, who was 9, and little Liv, who was just 2 years old. And a homestead that demanded everything. It was in this context of loss and desperation that Emil began to think about the tunnel. He had not always intended to build it. The idea did not come to him in a flash of inspiration or a moment of genius. It came from desperation, from watching animals die, from feeling the cold penetrate through the walls of his cabin, from wondering if he could survive one more winter, if his children could survive one more winter. But in the winter of 1888, something happened that crystallized everything, that made the vague idea into an urgent necessity. A blizzard came in early February, a storm of extraordinary violence that seemed to tear at the very structure of the cabin, that seemed to have the intention of destroying everything human beings had built. The wind roared with a sound like nothing Emil had ever heard, a sound of pure force, of air moving at speeds that made it almost solid. The snow was not falling. It was flying horizontally, driven by wind that had no mercy. Emil had livestock that he needed to care for. 6 dairy cows, 2 oxen, 8 sheep, animals that depended on him for survival. The cows needed to be milked twice a day, or mastitis would set in and they would die. The animals needed water, needed hay, needed to be checked to ensure that none of them had fallen ill. But the blizzard made the 107 yards between cabin and barn into an impossible distance, a distance that might as well have been a mile, that might as well have been across the ocean. On the second day of the blizzard, Emil made a rope, tied one end securely to the cabin door and one end to himself, and he stepped out into the storm. He walked that distance blindfolded by snow, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction, the rope the only thing that kept him oriented, the only thing that prevented him from becoming completely lost in the white. He felt like he was walking through a living thing, a thing that was trying to suffocate him, that was trying to kill him, that had its own malevolent intention. The cold penetrated his coat. The wind knocked him sideways. Twice he fell to his knees and had to pull himself back up using the rope. When he reached the barn, he could barely find it. The barn was dark and cold, and the animals were pressed together, shivering, their breath visible in the frigid air, their warmth creating a small island of life in the overwhelming cold. They had huddled together for protection, pressing their bodies against each other to share what little warmth they could generate. One of the sheep had already died. It lay in the corner of the barn, rigid with cold, and Emil realized he could not even tell when it had died. It could have been hours ago or a day ago. The animals and the cold had made time meaningless. He milked the cows, though his hands were so cold he could barely feel them. He checked each animal for injury or illness. He broke ice in the water trough and refilled it. Then he made the journey back to the cabin, feeling his way along the rope, feeling like he was walking back from the edge of death itself. He made it back to the cabin, and he sat by the fire that night while his children slept, silent except for the wind outside. He thought about the animals and the distance. He thought about a man he had known in Norway, back in Trøndelag, who had built a structure that connected his house to his barn. Not a tunnel exactly, but a covered passageway, a long structure with walls and a roof that allowed animals and humans to move between buildings without exposing themselves to the open air. But that had been in Norway, where the land was rocky and the labor could be shared with a community, where neighbors helped neighbors, where the work could be distributed across many hands. Here he was alone except for his children. Here the land was vast and mostly empty, and the work would have to be done with his own hands and the hands of his sons. The work would be enormous. And then he remembered his great-grandmother's voice. He remembered that afternoon in December when he was 13 years old. He remembered the stone and the fire and the partnership between them. He remembered the understanding that had lived in his great-grandmother's hands, the knowledge that heat does not disappear, it only moves. And he began to understand something that no one else in the settlement had yet grasped. Something that came from his Norwegian heritage. Something that he had learned decades earlier and stored in his mind without knowing he would need it. The tunnel could be more than just a passageway. The tunnel could be a thermal device. The tunnel could carry the heat from the barn, the body heat from the animals, the tremendous amount of warmth that 6 cows generated, directly into the cabin. Each cow generates approximately 1,000 British thermal units of heat per hour, a continuous radiation of warmth from their bodies as they digest hay and maintain their body temperature. 6 cows meant 6,000 BTU of continuous heat, radiating constantly, warming the air around them. In addition, the 2 oxen generated another 1,000 to 1,500 BTU per hour. The 8 sheep contributed several hundred more. In total, the barn was generating approximately 7,000 to 8,000 BTU of heat every single hour. Heat that was being lost into the barn space and the prairie air. But what if the heat could be captured? What if the tunnel could be built in such a way that the warm air from the barn would naturally flow toward the cooler cabin, carrying the animal heat with it, using basic thermodynamic principles that required no energy input, that worked with the laws of physics rather than against them? The understanding seemed to come to him fully formed, as if his great-grandmother was speaking through his own mind, as if 95 years of accumulated knowledge had been waiting for this moment to manifest itself in his understanding. On March 15th, 1889, Emil began to dig. He started at the cabin and dug toward the barn, and the work was harder than he had anticipated. The earth was not soft. The earth was compacted and frozen from the winter, and it seemed to resist him actively, as if it did not want to be disturbed. Emil had a spade and a pickaxe, and he used both, breaking the ground into pieces small enough to move. But Emil dug, and his oldest son Eric, who was 17 years old and strong from a lifetime of work, dug beside him, and slowly the trench began to take shape. The work took every ounce of their strength. Emil's hands developed blisters that turned into calluses. His back ached constantly. His shoulders burned. But he dug anyway. He dug because animals had died. He dug because his great-grandmother's knowledge lived in his hands, and he could not ignore it. Emil's plan was simple but calculated. Dig a tunnel approximately 40 feet long, connecting the cabin to the barn, roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, leaving enough space for a man to move through and work, but not so much space that the heat would dissipate unnecessarily into unused volume. The tunnel would slope slightly, perhaps 1 inch of drop every 8 feet, so that any condensation would run toward the barn rather than pooling in the middle and freezing into barriers. He would line the floor and walls with stone where possible, using the thermal mass properties that his great-grandmother had taught him. And he would shore the walls with timber to prevent collapse, to support the earth above. By April, the tunnel had extended about 15 feet from the cabin. His hands were bleeding. His back was in constant pain. But the tunnel existed. By May, it was 30 feet, halfway complete. The spring warmth was melting the frozen earth slightly, making the digging somewhat easier, though the water that resulted created a different problem. The tunnel sometimes flooded with runoff. By June, it was nearly complete, reaching almost to the barn. The work was relentless, unceasing, demanding every hour of daylight. Emil and Eric dug every day from sunrise until dark, stopping only when they could no longer see. Knut, who was 14, and Soren, who was 11, hauled the excavated earth in buckets and baskets, carrying it away from the tunnel site. Astrid, who was 9, brought water from the well so that her father and brothers could drink, could maintain their strength for the work. Little Liv, who was only 3 years old now, would walk alongside the tunnel and watching her family build something that seemed impossible. The tunnel emerged beneath the ground like something being slowly born, like a creature emerging from the womb of the earth. The stone lining was completed first. Emil and Eric gathered stone from the riverbed, traveling several miles by oxen to find suitable rocks, carrying back loads of stone. They carefully positioned each stone along the walls of the tunnel, packing soil between them, creating a layer of thermal mass that would absorb heat and release it slowly. Then they shored the structure with timber, using logs that Emil had cut and prepared in previous years. The tunnel was open at both ends when they finished in late June. One end connected to the cabin basement, one end opening into the barn foundation. But Emil realized, as he stood in the completed tunnel in late June, exhausted beyond measure, that the tunnel alone would not do what he needed it to do. The tunnel needed to be designed so that the heat from the barn would actually move through it, carried by air currents that would need to be directed intentionally. The warm air needed to be guided. It would not simply move on its own without direction. And so Emil made a crucial modification. He built a damper system in the barn section, a series of carefully constructed wooden panels that could be opened or closed to control airflow. In the winter, when the barn was warm from animal body heat and the cabin was cold from winter, the dampers would be opened, and the warm air would flow naturally from the barn through the tunnel and up into the cabin where the warmth would be needed. In the summer, the dampers would be closed, and the tunnel would serve only as a passageway, as a place for humans and animals to move between buildings safely. The principle was simple thermodynamics. Heat naturally rises and moves toward cold. If you create a path for the heat will follow that path, will move along the path you have created for it. This was not magic. This was physics. In July, when the tunnel was finished and the damper system was complete, Emil began to test it. The barn was warm during the day because the sun heated it, warming the air and the animals' bodies. But there was no fire in either the barn or the cabin during July. Still, Emil could feel the effect. When he opened the barn dampers in the afternoon and closed them before evening, measuring the temperature in the cabin before and after, the temperature in the cabin rose by approximately 3 degrees. It was a small thing, but it was proof that the principle worked. The heat moved, the tunnel conducted it, the dampers controlled it. By August, when the reality of the coming winter began to press down on him with its full weight, Emil had the evidence he needed. The tunnel would work. The tunnel would keep his animals alive. The tunnel would keep his family warm. But not everyone believed it. Jens Haugen, Emil's nearest neighbor, came to examine the tunnel in August and shook his head. Jens was a practical man, a man who believed in what could be proven through traditional means. A tunnel under the ground? Walls made of stone that were supposed to carry heat. It was the kind of thinking that came from desperation, Jens said, and desperation made men irrational. Heat rises, Jens said, standing in the barn and looking at the tunnel opening. Everyone knows this. You build a tunnel under the ground, the heat will escape into the soil. It will not reach the cabin. It will dissipate. And even if it did work, which it won't, the tunnel will collapse in the winter when the ice expands. You cannot keep a tunnel open when the frost is trying to break it apart. Jens's wife Brita came to look at it too, and she was more unkind than her husband. This is what comes from listening to old women's tales, she said, loud enough for others to hear. This is what happens when men believe in magic instead of hard work. The old countries are poor because they waste time on foolish ideas. We are in America now. We do real work. We do not dig holes and hope. By September, the story had spread through the settlement. Emil Larson had dug a tunnel because he was mad with grief. Emil Larson was wasting his strength. Emil Larson was proof that the frontier broke men's minds. The children at the schoolhouse made jokes about him. The wives shook their heads. Even his oldest son Eric began to doubt, though he said nothing to his father, though he helped with the work and kept his skepticism private. In October, as the first cold came and the days began to shorten, Emil prepared his cabin for winter in the traditional way. He stockpiled firewood, about 30 cords, which he estimated would heat the cabin for most of the winter if he was careful with his fire. He insulated the walls with mud and straw and cloth. He prepared for a winter like all the others, a winter where he would wake before dawn to feed the fire, where the cabin would never be completely warm, where the children would sleep under piles of blankets and wake with frost on their eyelashes. But he also prepared the tunnel. He cleaned it and made sure the dampers moved freely. He tested the system one more time, and then he waited for winter to come. In November, the first serious cold arrived. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees below zero and stayed there for 2 weeks. Emil lit his fire in the cabin fireplace, and he also opened the barn dampers. The effect was immediate. The cabin warmed faster than it ever had before. The floor stayed warm. The walls stopped sweating with condensation. Emil could feel the difference in the temperature immediately. By evening of the first day, his cabin was warmer than it had ever been in previous years, and he had used less than half the firewood he would normally have used. By the end of the 2-week cold spell, Emil had used approximately 15 cords of wood, less than Jens Haugen. Emil had burned through 5 cords, while Jens had needed 20. On November 20th, 1889, as the first serious winter was beginning, Emil invited Jens to his cabin. He did not say anything about the tunnel. He did not try to convince Jens of anything. He did not offer explanations or demonstrate calculations. He simply stood in his warm cabin, genuinely, radiantly warm. Warm in a way that Jens had never experienced in November, in a way that seemed almost impossible, and watched Jens's face change. Jens walked around the cabin, feeling the warmth. He put his hand on the wooden beams, and they were warm to the touch. He stood near a window, and the glass was not covered with ice on the interior, as it was in Jens's own cabin. He looked at the fireplace, and the fire was modest, carefully controlled, a modest flame that burned slowly, consuming perhaps 1 cord of wood per week. By comparison, Jens was burning through 3 cords of wood per week to maintain comparable warmth, and his cabin was not as warm. Jens's face went through a series of transformations, visible to Emil, readable as a narrative of understanding. First, confusion. How is this possible? Confusion etched into his weathered features, disbelief in his eyes. Then curiosity. What is happening here? What have I missed? What do I not understand? Then understanding. Realization dawning, a moment where knowledge crystallized, where the tunnel's purpose became clear. Then something that looked like anger at having been wrong, anger at having mocked Emil, anger at having underestimated his neighbor. "Show me," Jens said finally, his voice different now, stripped of its mockery, containing something like respect. Emil led him to the basement opening of the tunnel. They descended into the earth, and Emil opened the dampers. Immediately, warm air began to flow toward them, carrying with it the smell of the barn, the smell of hay and cattle and animal warmth. Jens stood in the tunnel and felt the warm air on his face. He understood. The winter of 1889 and 1890 was not unusually cold by Dakota standards. The temperature did not reach the extreme lows that some winters achieved, did not drop to the -50 degrees that Emil had experienced in 1887, but it was consistent, relentless, unforgiving. The cold came in November and did not fully leave until March, a 4-month siege. Day after day, week after week, the temperature stayed below 0 Fahrenheit, except for occasional warm spells when it might climb to 5 or 10 degrees above zero before plummeting again. Blizzards came approximately every 2 weeks, sudden storms that dropped visibility to near zero and dumped 2 to 4 feet of new snow. Every day, Emil opened the barn dampers, and every day, the heat from the 6 cows generating 1,000 BTU per hour, the 2 oxen generating another 1,500 BTU, and the 8 sheep generating several hundred more, flowed through the tunnel and into the cabin. Every night, Emil closed the dampers, closing them tight so that heat would not escape back into the barn. And the barn cooled. But the animal's body heat kept it at a survivable temperature, kept it above freezing, and every morning, Emil started a small fire in the fireplace, used only as a supplementary heat source. And that fire, combined with the heat that had accumulated in the cabin overnight from the barn heat, from the thermal mass of the stone-lined tunnel, kept the cabin warm throughout the day. The cabin temperature stayed between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit constantly, which was not tropical warmth, but was the difference between life and death. The difference between children being able to play and children being confined to near the fire with layers of blankets. The difference between animals surviving the winter and animals dying. By January of 1890, 3 other families who had watched Emil and been skeptical, families who had seen the tunnel work over the months of November and December, families who understood now that they had been wrong, had begun building their own tunnels. By February, 8 families had begun construction. The knowledge spread the way knowledge spreads among desperate people, like a virus, spreading from person to person, from household to household, like a secret being passed in whispers, like salvation, like a path out of suffering. Neighbors who had mocked Emil now came to ask him questions about construction, about dimensions, about the physics of heat transfer. By April of 1890, when the snow melted and the tunnels became accessible for inspection, when the work could be examined in daylight and measured and understood, Jens Haugen stood in his own completed tunnel and could barely believe that it was real. His tunnel was 38 feet long, running beneath the prairie from his cabin foundation to his barn. It had taken him and his sons nearly 5 months of work, breaking frozen earth, hauling stone, shoring the walls with timber, but it was finished. And by the next winter, in 1890, Jens's cabin would be warm because of an idea that Emil Larsen had remembered from his great-grandmother's voice, knowledge that had traveled from Norway to Dakota Territory, knowledge that proved that the old ways worked even in the New World. In March of 1890, a man named Magnus Eriksson came to Emil's homestead. Magnus was a structural engineer from the University of Minnesota, a man in his 50s with a scientific mind and the authority of academic knowledge. He had heard rumors about the tunnel system that was being built on the Dakota frontier, rumors that seemed impossible to him. Rumors that suggested that farmers with no formal training were implementing principles of thermodynamic transfer. He wanted to examine it and understand how it worked. He needed to verify whether the stories were true or if they were the result of desperate men misunderstanding ordinary phenomena. Magnus spent 3 days in Emil's cabin, and he measured everything. He measured the tunnel's dimensions with precision, recording length, width, and height at multiple points along its path. He measured the temperature at different points along the tunnel, at the barn entrance, at the middle point, at the cabin entrance, at different times of day. He measured the temperature in the barn during the day and at night, measured the temperature in the cabin throughout the day and night. He measured the temperature outside, recorded the wind speed and direction when possible. He took notes constantly, page after page filled with observations and numbers and calculations. He burned fuel, measured the weight of wood burned, calculated thermal efficiency. On the last day of his visit, Magnus sat with Emil in the warm cabin, a cabin that was maintained at a comfortable temperature with minimal fuel expenditure, and asked him where he had learned this technique. "From my great-grandmother," Emil said simply, with the quiet certainty of someone speaking a truth that needed no elaboration or defense. "In Norway, in Trøndelag, they have been building systems like this for hundreds of years. My great-grandmother was named Elsa Halvorsdatter. She lived 90 winters. She taught me that heat does not disappear. It does not vanish. It only moves. It only changes form. It only looks for a place to go. You have to know how to ask it to move where you need it to move. You have to build the path for it. Heat will follow the path you make." Magnus wrote that down carefully in his notebook. And then he asked permission to write a paper about the system for an engineering journal. Emil granted permission without hesitation, understanding that the knowledge had been given to him to be passed on, understanding that his great-grandmother would have wanted this knowledge to spread, to be preserved, to be documented in the permanent record of human understanding. The paper was published in 1891 in the Journal of Structural Engineering. The paper brought visitors. Engineers came from as far as Milwaukee and Chicago to examine the system, to measure it, to understand how a Norwegian farmer on the frontier had implemented principles of thermal transfer that they themselves had studied in universities. Farmers from Minnesota and Wisconsin began building their own versions, adapting the system to their specific situations, their specific buildings, their specific animals. The knowledge that had lived in Emil's great-grandmother's memory, knowledge that had been at risk of disappearing when the family crossed the ocean, became public knowledge, became documented, became part of the academic record. By the turn of the century, by 1900, variations of the tunnel system had been built in homesteads across the northern United States, in Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, the places where winters killed without mercy and where every innovation meant survival. Eric, Emil's oldest son, who had dug beside his father, who had learned the system at its inception, became a builder himself. He learned the tunnel system completely, understood not just how to build it, but why it worked, understood the physics and the principles and the adaptation. He taught others, sons, nephews, local farmers who wanted to learn. He built 23 tunnels in Dakota Territory in Minnesota over his lifetime, in farms from 1889 to 1945. Each one was slightly different, adapted to the specific needs of the homestead, to the number of animals, to the configuration of the buildings, to the soil conditions. But all of them followed the principles that Emil had learned from his great-grandmother. Knut, Emil's second son, took over the homestead, and he spent 50 years maintaining and improving the tunnel system. He made modifications based on what he learned each winter. He experimented with different stone arrangements, different configurations of the damper system. He developed a more efficient damper system that required less adjustment. His work made the tunnel more reliable and more efficient, more responsive to changing conditions. Soren became a teacher and taught the fundamentals of heat transfer to students in the school at Aberdeen, South Dakota. He never wrote a scientific paper, never published his work, but he spent his life teaching the next generation to understand that heat was not magic. It was not superstition. It was physics. And physics could be understood and controlled by anyone who paid attention, who observed, who thought carefully about how materials behaved. Astrid married a man from Minneapolis and moved to the city. And she lived in a modern house with modern conveniences. But she insisted that the house be built with radiant floor heating based on the principles that her father had pioneered. She became known in her community as the woman who lived in a warm house, the woman whose floors were warm on cold days. And women would visit her home just to feel the warmth, to experience the comfort, to understand what was possible. Little Liv, who had been only 3 years old when the tunnel was completed, grew up with the tunnel as the most normal thing in the world. She could not remember a time when it did not exist, could not imagine heating a cabin without the tunnel's contribution. She married a man who owned land in Minnesota, and she had children, and she told them stories about their great-great-grandmother Elsa, about how her knowledge had survived an ocean crossing, about how her voice had carried across 50 years and an ocean and had changed the way people lived in America. Emil lived to be 83 years old, which was a remarkable age for a man who had lived a life of such physical labor. He lived to see his grandchildren born, lived to see them grow, lived to see them carry on the knowledge. He lived to see the tunnel become accepted and commonplace, lived to see neighbors who had mocked him now asking him for advice. He lived long enough to know that his great-grandmother's knowledge was not lost, that it had not disappeared when the family crossed the ocean. It was alive. It was spreading. It was changing the way hundreds of families survived the winter, changing the way thousands of people experienced the cold, transforming the frontier from a place of suffering into a place where survival was possible, where comfort could be achieved even in the most brutal climate. He died in 1931, in the cabin that he had built 60 years earlier, lying on a bed in a room that was warm because the tunnel beneath the cabin was carrying the heat from the barn, heat generated by the descendants of the 6 cows that had inspired its creation. His children were with him. His grandchildren were there. The family was gathered around, and they were warm, and they were safe, and they were alive because Emil Larsen had remembered his great-grandmother's voice. The tunnel system became the foundation of a technology that is now used across the world. Radiant floor heating, as it is called today, is one of the most efficient heating systems available. It is installed in hospitals, schools, homes, office buildings, and public spaces from New York to Tokyo, from Copenhagen to Sydney. The global market for radiant floor heating products and installation exceeds $5 billion annually. Engineers study Emil's principles in universities. Architects design buildings with his knowledge. Billions of people live in spaces that are heated using the exact same physics that Emil's great-grandmother understood and passed down through the generations. In the village of Trøndelag in Norway, there is a small museum dedicated to the history of building techniques. Among the exhibits is a photograph of Emil Larsen, taken in 1910 when he was 62 years old. He is standing in front of his cabin with his hand resting on the log wall. His face shows the wear of a life lived on the frontier. His hands are scarred and weathered. But his eyes show something else. They show a man who understood something fundamental about survival, that the best technology is often not new. It is old. It is the knowledge that your ancestors carried in their bodies and their voices. It is the understanding that heat and stone and patience can accomplish things that seem impossible. It is the belief that an old woman's teaching, delivered across decades, across an ocean, across continents, can change the world. Elsa Halvorsdottir, Emil's great-grandmother, never knew that her voice would echo across a century. She never knew that the knowledge she had passed to her great-grandson would transform the way human beings lived. She died in Norway, in a world she never left, in a place where her innovations were simply normal. But she lived on in Emil. She lived on in his children and grandchildren. She lives on today in every person who stands on a warm floor on a cold day and does not realize that they are standing on the legacy of a woman who refused to let the old ways die. The next time you feel the gentle, radiant warmth beneath your feet, the next time you are comfortable on a cold day because the floor itself is warm, remember that you are experiencing a technology that is 140 years old. Remember that it comes from a great-grandmother in Norway who understood that heat and stone could dance together. Remember that it comes from a man on the Dakota frontier and who was brave enough to trust the knowledge of the past. Brave enough to dig when others mocked. Brave enough to build a tunnel between his cabin and his barn because he refused to let his animals die. Remember that the best solutions to our problems are often already in the hands of our ancestors, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be built, waiting to be carried forward into a new world where they become new again. The knowledge is there. The wisdom is there. It has been passed down through generations because it works. The only question is whether you are brave enough to listen to what the old ones are telling you. Emil Larsen was brave enough. His great-grandmother's voice was strong enough to carry across an ocean and across a lifetime. And the world is still warm because of it. Until next time, stay curious, honor those who came before, and never underestimate the wisdom hiding in your own family history. The future is often built from the past. You just have to remember how to listen.